Good afternoon and welcome from wherever you are in the continent or around the globe. My name is Pamela Maseko. I'm the Executive Dean of the Humanities Faculty at Northwest University that is co-hosting this event. This webinar, titled Gender Dynamics and Support Systems, is the fifth in the webinar series that seeks to center humanities, social sciences, and indigenous knowledge systems in the narrative discourse around the COVID-19 pandemic that the global society is grappling with at the moment. The introduction to the United Nations policy brief on the impact of COVID-19 on women states that the year 2020, so it states that the year 2020, marking the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Platform for Action, was intended to be groundbreaking for gender equality. Instead, with the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic, even the limited gains made in the past decades are at risk of being rolled back. The pandemic is deepening pre-existing inequalities, exposing vulnerabilities in social, political, and economic systems, which are in turn amplifying the impacts of the pandemic. So the slow gains made globally in fighting discrimination against women and girl children have been overturned by the spike in gender-based violence as girls and women are sheltering in place with their abusers. The loss of employment for women who hold the majority of insecure, informal, and lower-paying jobs, the risk shouldered by the world's nurses who are predominantly women, and the rapid increase in unpaid domestic work that girls and women mostly provide already. From these, it would seem that the social and economic effects of the COVID-19 pandemic will be felt disproportionately by the women and girls, and I must add, by the LGBTQI persons globally. And what does this mean? What does Africa say to these things? The isiXhosa term for woman is unozala, which literally means the source of life. Whenever something catastrophic occurred to a woman in the village where I grew up, my grandmother would say, "Lingathini ihlabathi ukuthi cwaka, unozala isifa." So in the foreign language, this translates to, how can the soil be quiet when the source of life is dying? So if we foreground the HSS, the IKS, and Africa in our engagement on this topic, what is the African conceptualization about these issues in the time of the pandemic? What are our grandmothers saying about these things, and what have they been saying about these things? What can we learn from the history of the continent about these matters? Let me take this opportunity to extend a special welcome to the panelists who are going to lead the conversation today on this subject that is topical across the globe and that is more pronounced during this time of the pandemic. Prof. Maud de Covet, Dr. Tendai Garutsa, and Prof. Alena Sehuje provided fascinating abstracts of their talks, and I'm looking forward, I'm sure you are too, to their engagement with the topic. They will be introduced later in the program by the facilitator. I wish to emphasize to the panelists that you each have about 10 minutes to speak and present your position arguments, and this will be followed by engagement with questions that will emanate from the audience as they listen to your inputs. At this point, let me make a few announcements with regards to our communication etiquette during the session. The chat, audio, and video functions have been disabled for the attendees. There is a Q&A, question and A platform or button that can be used to post your questions and comments to the speakers. This can be done at any point during the presentation. We want the presentations to be engaging, and so please, whenever there is a need, post your question, post your comments for the speakers. All of them, the panelists, will respond to your questions posted. They will all respond at the end of the presentations. As you may have already noted, this webinar series is an outcome of a continental, interinstitutional, and interdisciplinary collaboration between Northwest University, Namibia University of Technology, Science and Technology, and the Madisebo Institute, as well as humanities, social sciences, and indigenous knowledge systems as disciplines collaborating. I wish to acknowledge Prof. Alina Sehuje, the Dean of Human Sciences at NUST, as well as Dr. Koitsi Wemoteo from the IKS Center in the Faculty of Agriculture and Natural Sciences at NWU, and Dr. Mucholobo Zulumatabo Zulu from the Madisebo Institute, and all our colleagues who have been supportive within these three institutions that I've mentioned. I also want to make a special mention of Prof. Nene Sekhabi from our research office, whose office facilitated and funded this collaborative effort. Before I hand over to the facilitator of the webinar, let me announce the next webinar in this series. It is themed Community Engagement and Organic Intellectuals, and it will be held at the same time next week on Thursday. You are invited in numbers, and we are looking forward to seeing you there. Thank you very much, Paul. Let me take this opportunity to introduce the facilitator of the session, Dr. Juliet Sylvia Passy. Dr. Passy is a senior lecturer in the Department of Communication at Namibia University of Technology, Science and Technology, pardon. Her research interests are environmentalism in literature, issues of gender in literature, children's literature, as well as new literary forms that are emerging on social media. In 2016, she received the Teaching Excellence Award at faculty level. She is currently the editor-in-chief of the NAWA Journal of Language and Communication. She's also currently working on a book script, provisionally titled Ecofeminism, the Environment and Cultural Resistance in African Women's Fiction. Over to you, Dr. Passy.
Thank you so much, Prof. Pam, and a warm welcome to you all. A special welcome to our colleagues from Northwest University and across the region. Let me say it is a great delight to have such a large group of people who have expressed interest in this important conversation on the topic gender dynamics and support systems. But my plea is, let us not use this webinar as a smoke screen that assumes COVID-19 is just a phase or a season in our lives that will eventually come to pass. The intention for holding this webinar is to use it as a platform that will allow us to engage in gender issues, that is using a gender lens and also interrogating COVID-19 issues. So using the gender lens, the platform is going to allow us to look at burning gender issues as they have been experienced pre and during COVID-19 lockdown. As such, let me say to you all that this webinar is important because it is an opportunity to start a conversation on gender issues. Let us take this webinar as an opportunity to ask thought-provoking questions on gender justice and the body politic in Southern Africa and beyond. And my hope is that the webinar will draw meaningful debate on what should be done to accelerate meaningful participation in the fight against gender issues in this COVID lockdown and beyond. Our thrust basically is not an accident, given that August was a month that dealt with and interrogated varied women issues. And it is not an accident, again, that the speakers today on this platform are all women. So more importantly, I'm sure you agree with me that COVID-19 has had different impacts on men, different impacts on women and children. Men and children have different susceptibilities to the virus, and they also have different vulnerabilities as a result of gender-related factors. And given this background, let me say, if we are not conscious, if we are not calculative, if we are not careful, COVID-19 can mutate into a cycle of time and space where we enter into something and never exit from it. And webinars such as this one are actually a bid to try and alert us to refuse to stay stuck and stay stagnant in such situations. And because of this, strategic plans for COVID-19 preparedness and response must be grounded in stronger gender analysis, and they must ensure meaningful participation of affected groups, especially the silenced groups, women and children. It is important that they be involved in implementation, in decision-making, and let us be aware that transformation that does not include women is incomplete transformation. I think Ogodipe Leslie actually says it through her Stewanism theory. We need transformation that is inclusive, that beyond the women's spaces, we have human spaces. And women, girls, and men make that human space. So I hope that the insights that will be drawn from today's presentation will be used in the understanding of the COVID-19 pandemic to reconstruct and reform the systems that impact negatively on both men and women's everyday existence. And I'm sure for those, I am a literature specialist, and literature has spoken a lot about women's spaces. And as I said earlier on, we wouldn't want to be stuck and be stagnant. And if I'm reminded of Tambo, for example, in Tsitsi Dangaremba's 3 novels, her trajectory from nervous conditions, past the Book of Notes, past this mournable body, we find her stuck in a cycle that she has entered into, but she cannot exit. And hopefully, this webinar is one way of saying to us all, let us move on. Let us hear from our speakers and what they have to say about the dynamism in gender and the support systems during COVID-19 and beyond. Our first speaker is Dr. Maud Dikobe. She is a senior lecturer at the University of Botswana, where she teaches in the area of African diaspora and gender studies. Her scholarship lies in the nexus between gender and human rights. She has more than 20 years of expertise working on gender equality issues, including gender and development, gender-based violence, gender and women's empowerment, mentoring for women in decision-making positions and those venturing into politics. At regional and global level, she has worked with SADC, Pan-African Parliament, UNFPA, UN Women, UNESCO, IDEA International, UNICEF, and UNECA, among others. Dr. Dikobe was the chair of the Gender Policy and Programs Committee, GPPC, at the University of Botswana. She is an active member of civil society organizations and engaged in civil dialogues lobbying for gender equality. She served as a member of the Botswana Commission on Women and contributed to the drafting and finalization of the SADC Protocol on Gender Development. Dr. Dikobe, the floor is yours. I thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Pasi, and greetings to all other panelists today. I think as already stated in my abstract, I'm going to look at how, although we have low numbers of COVID in Botswana, the COVID-19 has triggered another pandemic, which is gender-based violence, especially domestic violence, in a rather unprecedented manner. So in my presentation, I'll be looking at the numbers of women who were victims of GBV during the lockdowns in Botswana. And also the presentation, because the focus is on adopting a gender lens, I'll try to shed some light on the gender dynamics and how they are shaped by the tangible practices embedded in our everyday lives. I also would like to raise two questions just to jumpstart the presentation or the dialogue. It's like, which structures are enabling or failing women and girls during an emergency as is this one, and why? And secondly, how can we counteract reactionary understanding of gender and gender roles in Botswana? What I see as a problem in Botswana is that we have GBV has been neglected as a consequence of COVID-19. And I feel that we need to piece together gender dynamics around COVID-19 in order to arrive at effective solutions to deal with this imminent pandemic. But let me briefly define gender dynamics, or just comment on gender dynamics. Gender dynamics themselves are informed by our socio-cultural ideas about gender and power relations that define them. So you find that women are experiencing GBV in differing degrees, depending on which country they're in. And because gender dynamics are very critical, because they can reinforce or challenge existing norms. So in Botswana, we still have problematic gender dynamics besides the passing of several bills and laws. We have the Domestic Violence Act, which was in Botswana passed in 2008. We have the National Children's Act, which was passed in 2009. But these laws alone do not protect our women. So I think that there's a gap when it comes to research or gender research, that there's limited research that looks into gender differences and perceptions of gender-based violence, especially during the COVID. And this lack of qualitative research, which could engage indigenous knowledge system, means that some of the stories by the women who have never been published or published anything remain to be unheard. And if the women's voices are heard, we cannot continue to speak for them. So I'm agitating for a paradigm shift where we can use indigenous knowledge systems and also gear more towards qualitative research as versus quantitative research in order to arrive at the root cause of the problems that women face, hence which contribute to gender-based violence in Botswana. But by adopting a gender lens in my presentation, I will also interrogate how the pandemic affects men and women differently. And by doing so, I'll be engaging a gender conscious lens, not a gender blind lens, because as we know, the pandemic affects men and women differently. In Botswana, for example, the subtitle of my topic is, oh, sorry. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Doctor.
Okay, but then
the other people.
Yeah, I cannot see you. I cannot see myself on the screen.
Your screen has been projected with your name and picture.
Oh, okay. All right.
And we
Yeah.
can hear you. Yes.
So I was saying that we need to look at how the gender-based violence affects men and women differently in our research, so that we can arrive at effective solutions that can address these long-term problems faced by women and girls in Botswana, but not just during the pandemic, but also before the pandemic, because gender-based violence is not a new kid on the block in Botswana. It's not a new phenomenon. A significant body of scholarship interrogating GBV in Botswana already exists, but we can still draw lessons from existing literature and use it to promote inclusion and response to COVID-19. But what the pandemic has brought to close scrutiny in Botswana is that not only are Botswana women the majority of the caregivers, but that they are also the backbones of the families. Hence the subtitle of my presentation, which can be Mangwana o tshwara thipa ka ha bogaleng. My colleagues from the Northwest University would understand this, and from Namibia too, which can be loosely translated as a mother would do anything for her child, such as skipping a meal so that the children can eat, or a woman will go as far as protecting the children from abuses, finding food for the child, and ensuring that the child lives in a conducive environment. What made me choose this Tswana proverb is a way of gesturing towards the wealth of knowledge embedded in our indigenous knowledge system. Because this Tswana proverb captures the complexities of being a mother without support during COVID. But it's also used to highlight how we can use the agency theory from feminist studies to appreciate women's multiple roles as active actors for change in our communities. So briefly, if we look at the traditional support system or safety nets, it used to be common to bank on the fact that it takes a village to raise a child. So traditionally, the woman did not have to battle alone, with the understanding that there were other people rallying behind her. And because women continue to be caregivers, breadwinners, we find that they cannot be with their children 24/7, as they have to work outside the home and live in the care of their children with some members of the extended family. But this is where the problem comes in, which I call the demise of the lockdown. During the lockdown in Botswana, we found an increase in severity and frequency of GBV. And it was during the lockdown when both the mothers and the children had to spend a lot of time with the perpetrators that the numbers of GBV, especially domestic violence and rape, escalated. And of course, these are only superficial numbers due to lack of database and unfair reporting of GBV cases. And I'd like Jan now to share with us the slides, which comprises of different headlines from different newspapers. It shows that during the first patch of lockdown, 49 cases of rape involved children, one of which was a small boy raped, a boy raped by his father. And following that, we recorded 52 cases of people living with disability who were sexually abused. And this dates as far back as 2019. And this year, between the 1st and 30th June, police have recorded 531 cases of domestic violence and 181 cases, or out of this 181 cases were those of rape. But the picture above is been foiled by several factors: eroded family ties, moral decay, lack of care for children as mothers, and because mothers who work in the informal sector have to hustle outside the home as informal traders. Absences and gaps in family systems where we can no longer fall back on the extended family. And this has taken an emotional toll on women. Another area which needs serious study, where we look at the psychosocial trauma that women go through or are going through during the pandemic. And
about 2 minutes left, Dr.
Yeah,
Covet.
yeah, because I expect, yes, thank you, because they expected to go by the saying that Mangwana authority pagabo. With that, I have 2 recommendations. I think that it's critical that we adopt a gender lens that would offer a multifarious approach to GBV. And I think research alone is not enough. If governments do not provide implementation and support aimed at preventing GBV, even in post-COVID-19. And in order to arrive at effective solutions, I still insist we need to update data sources, like coming up with gender disaggregated data and promote gender responsive budgeting that policymakers and researchers can rely on. Above all, I think there's call for activism so that there's an intersection of policy, research, practice, and activism. And protection service need to be in place and inclusive to accommodate LGBTIQI. And also, we have to promote gender mainstream by adapting gender lens and addressing GBV. And I'm thankful that we have started these networks, which are aimed at advocacy through reference groups. And from this, I think we can come up with research that will inform policies in our respective countries. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dikobe, for that insightful presentation that takes us back to our origins. And significantly, we are being reminded that they are still important in our lives and they still mold our philosophies. Hence, we should not forget about them. Thank you for that insightful presentation. Can I also remind our listeners that you need to post your comments, your questions on the QA forum, please, during or after the presenter or during the course of the 3 presentations. We now move on to our second panelist, Dr. Tendai Garuta. Dr. Tendai is an early career researcher, a subject chair and senior lecturer in the Sociology Department, School of Social Sciences at the Northwest University. She is a recipient of the Climate Impact Research Capacity and Leadership Enhancement Program hosted by the African Academy of Sciences, ISA, and the Association of Commonwealth Universities, ACU. She serves in a number of portfolios, including the National Research Foundation, NRF Humanities Review Board, Population and Health Research Entity, and recognition of prior learning committees within the Faculty of Humanities at the Northwest University. She has published DHET accredited articles in the area of gender, indigenous knowledge, food security, and pedagogy. Dr. Tendai, I hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pasi. I'm just going to continue from where Dr. Amaude left from. We see that there has been an increase in terms of gender-based violence cases in conjunction with the COVID-19 epidemic. In France and in Italy, at least 30%, an increase of 30% of domestic violence was actually recorded. And then within the South African context, about 120,000 calls were actually logged in, gender-based violence calls were logged in by the South African police services during the first 3 weeks of the lockdown. The question now becomes, why the surge, especially in the context of a disease outbreak? Is this a question of lessons unlearned, especially regarding that there were previous disease outbreaks? Remember that globally, this is not the first disease outbreak. Before, there was an Ebola outbreak between 2014 to 2016 in West Africa. And Sierra Leone actually documented that most women and children, they were abused, they were violated, and there were no statistics. As much as those reports were published, the issues to do with gender dynamics were not really prioritized. In Latin America, during the Zika outbreak, the reports actually point towards the gendered impact. So there is that nexus between, or the interface between disease outbreaks and also gender dimensions in terms of how women, masculine minorities, or even other genders are affected by disease outbreaks. Now, when we're talking about the nexus between domestic violence and COVID-19 and patriarchy, COVID-19 have reinforced, it has reproduced the existing power imbalances and patriarchal norms at individual, societal, as well as structural levels. In the private sphere, patriarchy actually creates a system where subordinate masculinities, women, third genders, intersex people, or even the less vulnerable have less bargaining power, thereby intensifying or breeding violence. In the public sphere, we see an essentialist or masculine language operating through the policy documents, which dichotomizes gender, sex, and sexuality. And in that sense, it actually leaves cognitive gaps pertaining to the COVID-19 data relating to GBV or domestic violence. So that lack of research actually reflects on these various intersections, compounding in that interwoven forms of oppression can actually lead to inaccurate depictions of domestic violence within the COVID-19 context. So now, where does intersectionality fit in? Is it an appropriate framework to actually resolve some of the problems that are being faced, especially when it comes to domestic violence? An intersectionality framework actually realizing a contestation or renegotiation of gender, sexuality, race in the prevention and response of domestic violence cases within the COVID-19 context. Women, men, and other genders are not a homogeneous group. They're not static groups. And utilizing a gender lens alone without understanding other structural features can actually obscure the other various forms of oppression that intersect and create multiple disadvantages or even privileges pertaining to the perpetrators of this domestic violence cases. In a recent address by President Ramaphosa within the South African framework, when he was talking about reducing gender-based violence, he received a backlash from the queer community, considering the omission of sexual minorities. This then points to the challenging of the institutionalized structural patriarchal privileging of heterosexuality. And when we look at the issues of gender and disease outbreaks, there is limited research pertaining to how victims, like male victims, there are other gay men who are actually being violated and victimized within the context of domestic violence. Because when we're talking about gender, we're talking about even the subordinated masculinities, we're talking about the vulnerable sections of the society, like the disabilities, even minority women. So now, the vulnerable sections of the society, they experience multiple vulnerabilities, and this actually leads to greater risk of the long-term consequences of the COVID-19 due to the constrained health systems, considering that much of the funding is diverted towards reducing the impact of COVID-19. And this means that the people that actually face or are the victims of domestic violence, they are at a very disadvantaged space. So without that intersectional lens, we cannot truly provide an effective gender-informed COVID-19 response that considers the needs of the vulnerable sections of the society. Secondly, the positionality and the context is very important when we're talking about gender, domestic violence, and COVID response. What about the women in migration camps, detention centers, who are in prisons, who are in urban slums, and those who are homeless? They do not even have the same experience as those who have adequate space for social distancing. They are intersecting or interwoven identities like gender, positionality, socioeconomic, class, race, or migration status can actually make them more vulnerable and victims of this domestic violence. So now, in essence, in summary, why an intersectional approach? It is actually appropriate because it will guide the national and global response to the COVID-19 pandemic and ensuring the promotion and the adoption to equity responsive programs which are socially just, such that even the minorities of the society, the vulnerable sections of the societies can be adequately can actually adequately access the resources that they need, and the response as well as policy frameworks can actually look into issues that these vulnerable sections of the society face. The last question becomes, how then do we manage to use an intersectional framework within a disease outbreak, or how can we apply it within the COVID-19 context vis-a-vis domestic violence? There is no fundamental way of approaching intersectionality. There are various ways of doing it, as long as it's not an additive approach, meaning that it might be an issue that a person is disadvantaged because of their gender. But if they have other factors like race, disability, positionality, then it means that they are even in a worsened position. Fundamental questions that we need to put into perspective to avoid this universalizing categories when designing or conceptualizing or interpreting gender-based or domestic violence research are what and who is being studied, and who is being studied and compared to who and why. And also, is there adequate information in terms of aspects of social location, the study location, the issues of sex, ethnicity, class, and other categories. And for policymakers, they actually need to make sure that there is equal representation in terms of leadership positions across government, private sectors that promote gender-informed decision-making processes. So in conclusion, I actually argue that a one-size-fits-all approach is not appropriate in responding to issues of domestic violence within the COVID-19 context. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tendai, for making us aware that we need this multi-pronged approach to fight the COVID-19 pandemic. And we need to acknowledge the multiplicity of the experiences of the different people that we have the world over, including men, women, and children. We move on to our third panelist, Prof. Sehobe. Prof. Alina Sehobe is the Dean of Human Sciences at the Namibia University of Science and Technology. She is a fellow of the African Academy of Sciences. She has served as an advisor, facilitator, and expert for a number of international organizations. Prof. Sehobe's research includes the archaeology of Southern Africa, indigenous knowledge systems, heritage studies, gender, peace studies, and HIV and AIDS. She has authored and co-authored essays and book chapters on African archaeology, heritage, and development. Over to you, Prof.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pasi, and good afternoon, colleagues, and good evening to those who are elsewhere in the world. I would like to continue from where my two colleagues left off, and that is now taking the lens of how the COVID-19 pandemic and other related issues have affected a less seen or less heard audience, in this instance, children. My starting point is a moment of inspiration. In the 1980s, as a young activist, I happened to come across the work of John Agard, and one of his poems, Come From That Window, Child, really profoundly informed my, I would say, mindset and understanding of how we marginalize, invisibilize children. And thereafter, the song that came to my mind in my youth was a song that was titled, Where Have All the Flowers Gone? That song also helped me understand the impact of war and also of, I would say, gender, and in many regards, society's lens towards children in terms of how we view children. More recently, a poem by John Cashbaum, Where Have All the Children Gone?, has profoundly also grounded my understanding of what happens to children in complex times, especially times of crisis. The pandemic has highlighted a multiplicity, as has been said by my colleagues, of pandemics, one of which is that society is oftentimes ill-prepared for disaster. When that happens, we find that it brings into sharp relief how we usually underplay the importance of those who are less able or less strong in our societies. And in this instance, children have been more or less talked about, become objects of policy reform or review, but not necessarily being brought into these conversations. One notes how through time, our society has allowed us to become very immune to the voice of children in the context of violations, whether it's during the times of war, when conflicts happen. We've heard on the continent the issue of child soldiers, or whether it's in the context of other disasters, where oftentimes humanitarian efforts are targeted at adults and other more able persons as opposed to children. The pandemic right now, in terms of world numbers, has obviously begun to destroy the most important fabrics of our social existence, never mind the economy, never mind political systems. But as we speak today, across the world, more than 25 million people have been infected. We have deaths over the number of 800,000. And on the continent of Africa, we've seen also the impact of the pandemic insofar as it has affected children and, of course, communities. The biggest, of course, has been the impact in terms of homes and we could say households. Those who have homes to go to have been able to perhaps survive the worst. But as has been said by my colleagues, homes have also become places of insecurity and oftentimes violation. Children, as we've heard from Save the Children and UNICEF and UNESCO, more than 10 million children across the world may never go back to school. In the main, those will be children who are already facing vulnerabilities. They're living in camps, they're internally displaced, they're living in communities where they don't have any adequate shelter, access to sanitation, or any kind of food resources. So the multiple issues of hunger, poverty, and other kinds of care issues that come to children, bringing, I would say, an added layer of burden for these young people. In the main, girl children will be the ones who bear the burden of care when the pandemic takes its toll on the continent. We've been lucky so far across the continent in terms of numbers and figures. Only about 1.26 million people have been affected. I shouldn't say only because it is a significant number. We've also already seen more than 30,000 people dying from this pandemic, but compared to other continents, it's still an insignificant number. However, the data that's coming shows that we already have multiple, I would say, factors that are hurting our children and other community members. In this instance, food insecurity is a huge challenge. A lot of the communities across the continent rely on informal means of existence, in this case, jobs. And in the main, these were the first to be affected with the first batch of lockdowns. The militarization of the epidemic and the responses thereafter highlighted how the military becomes a strong arm of even a pandemic that needs public health responses. Furthermore, we saw that in terms of the ill-preparedness of our governments, the financial resources that should have gone into strengthening public health systems were not there. Similarly, children's education, healthcare issues were further taken out of the context of provision for care in the COVID-affected era, when every single resource was mobilized towards the COVID pandemic. So in terms of public health, other ailments, NCDs, and any others, including mental health, were not covered across the continent, especially in the context where the disease burden was high, which is in this instance, Southern Africa. When we look now, how do we see the future of children in a post-COVID world? It's important to bear in mind that the losses that we're seeing in the school year this year will continue to affect these children in the same manner that we saw in the 1970s in South Africa and across the region. When children lose out in school years, this translates to later inabilities and incapacities. In the instance of capacity to be able to look for future work and therefore security, these are diminished. So the big question then is, what has been the response of our leaders? At the national, at the regional, at the continental level, and of course at the global level, one finds that there's very little effort being made to place children at the center of the COVID response and the post-COVID response, whether it is from the point of view of their well-being health, mental health, or even planning into the future. It's surprising because many of our countries actually have national plans. In the main, most of these plans do not have a dedicated policy response in respect to children. Therefore, in terms of my own summation of this and what we can do in the human and social sciences, we need to be looking at how we can look at research as an avenue to first and foremost gather data that can inform us of what are the key policy issues that need to be addressed. We need to then have the paradigm shifts that need to make sure we have the chance to make the courageous decision that in the post-COVID world, a child must be the center of our policy-making decisions. I'm pleased that some institutions and think tanks across the continent already have begun this work. If we look at the work of the Human Science Research Council, the PEN network is one of those few voices that are dedicated towards issues of children from a policy perspective. The Child Institute in South Africa, also at UCT, has been doing amazing work, including, of course, giving policy direction and, of course, advocacy through the Child Gauge, which is a publication that brings out a summary of the key issues that address what are the needs and therefore action needed for children. I think in the main, in terms of research, we need to be looking at how we as social scientists, and especially as community-based activists in the human and social sciences, can begin to inform future policy decisions. Across the continent, the AU platform has given us a direction in terms of the Agenda 2063, the Africa we want. There's an African child or a youth charter that is in place. But in terms of vision, there's been discussions about a vision for the African child. What actually informs this? You'll find that in the main, some of the evidence that needs to be there in terms of research, baseline research, applied research is lacking. Therefore, I think it's important that we can begin to revisit the agenda of where do we place children as actors and as agents who should have their own agency in COVID response. As my colleagues have said, you find that children now who are in lockdown with parents or carers or other community members do not really have a voice insofar as being able to be self-supporting agents when it comes to speaking against abuse inside the home or even approaching service providers. When you look at countries that have social protection networks or systems, oftentimes accessing these is impossible for children unless they have a guardian. What are the kind of legal instruments that are necessary to ensure that children going forward can be enabled or supported to be able to become actors and agents in securing their own future and livelihoods? And I think in the main, whilst Africa may have escaped the severe impact of morbidity and mortality in terms of COVID-19, the future is less certain if no steps are taken to do the kind of groundwork that is necessary now. I believe going forward, we need to be able to engage children across the world, first and foremost, but particularly the African child, to make sure that they don't become the object of research, object of policy reform, but they become the focal actors in that process. And I'd like to conclude by citing some of the messages that Nelson Mandela has said before, if Paul could help me with this slide. Mandela has highlighted throughout his later life how it is important to make sure that children are at the center of our discourses, whether it's policy making, governance, or leadership. When he says that there can be no keener revelation of society's soul than the way in which it treats its children, this could not be more apt than looking at what has happened in terms of the COVID-impacted world. Further, when he says that we should treasure our children as the future, it highlights how it is important that in the construction of the post-COVID world on the continent and globally, children should be at the core of our search for a vaccine. Children should be at the core of our application of a post-COVID recovery plan, especially to ensure that education is first priority. Unfortunately, the current trends of militarizing the pandemic response, the current trends of placing leadership, election and electioneering at the heart of the response are further marginalizing those who are in need, namely our children. So to conclude, I'd say that as the University of Northwest and NUST, in initiating this discussion, we were hoping that we can begin to engage and provide a critical platform where engagement can be possible on these issues. And I think in the main, when you look at what we would have been able to achieve, it would be critical that in mobilizing a social lens, a human science informed lens that takes an indigenous knowledge perspective, we are able to say the future of the African child should be anchored in exploring how social cohesion and rooting that response of the child around a human rights informed platform of ensuring the security, safety, and well-being of that child is at the heart of our post-COVID response. Thank you very much for your attention. Over to you, Sylvia.
Thank you so much, Prof. Sehobe. Children should not be objectified. And thank you for making us aware that we need to be mindful of the nexus of power relations at play during this time. And our children should be heard, and they should be visible. Without wasting much time, can we then move on to the next item, which is a presentation, a performance by Ms. Kelesite Mohatle from Haberoni. Please keep the questions coming, make them short, precise. Thank you so much.
A mother sat, chin to her chest, heaving, dancing between her shoulders, for she refused to be comforted by the prowling beasts guilty of mauling her children. Women and mothers crying the tears of Rachel, lamentation heard in neighboring villages. She weeps for the captivity of her family, for her children are no more. That would be you. You so easily accept defeat and neglect the comforter, capital letter C, who says, let me advocate for the things you have accepted. Be not comforted by things, children. We must seek justice. Let his things be aligned in the way that they are supposed to be, straight, upright, and just. Self-admiration and complacency because you so easily are comforted by lies. Dreams and visions comforted with darkness and lies about the universe. They have made you phase and fade away from who you are and purpose. The money for your promotion, it exists. They just don't want you to have it. We used to laugh at a time when cell phones were said to replace people, but tell me, how is your family? We are a crooked, twisted, perverse generation, convenienced by shortcuts, unhappy as the black of shell. They've photoshopped what you consume and made you believe it real. They've labeled you millennials and written lazy bullet point articles cementing why you should stay stuck and afraid of real love. Don't fall into the lane of constructs and their acceptance. Things may go pear-shaped, but don't cross the line into their side. They want you to surrender your dreams for the hamster wheel, to accept defeat altogether. Stand firm, children. This generation lives based on lies about itself and authority, unfolding mental injustice like linen seared with the hot coals of Judas. Refuse to be comforted by people who want to use your pain to vicariously relive your trauma for their gain, past the horrors of raping your children. Reject the seduction of living for money and learning it's evil, lest your lips be waxed lyrical by serpent tongues sitting in parliament. Refuse reverse psychology and hand-me-downs. Refuse to be comforted by those who ask you to politely live with your rapists. Lies land pathetic when you must argue for your life. The prose and poetry in the tongue of your birth is the exact reason why they need your mouth shut. Nations celebrating violence with public holidays that leave them less accountable. If it worked, 16 days of activism would see less rape and bear slaps to our mothers' faces, arguments based on big English and high-tech snobbery. Don't let them tell you that your dreams need to be fancy. Corruption so prevalent you think it's a way of life. Be still. There is a time when violence will not be heard and terror will not come near us. Refuse to be comforted. Don't neglect the comforter. Refuse to be comforted by lies. We have the ultimate comforter.
Thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe.
Very touching, very moving performance. Thank you so much, Ms. Kelisiti. It shows how we need to restructure and revitalize our oral literatures so that they enlighten us and guide us and provide solutions to the current problems that we are facing. Thank you so much for that beautiful performance. Now we move on to the question and answer session. And I've received quite a number of questions. Right, please keep the questions coming. And like I say, try to make them very precise so that we don't spend a lot of time reading through them. Right, I've realized that with the gender lens that the three panelists have emphasized, I've actually been reminded of one quotation from Ongo Dipelezli. She says, "Are African women voiceless, or do we fail to look for their voices where we may find them? In the size and forms which these voices are uttered." Today, during the COVID-19 pandemic period, are we looking for our women and children in places where we can find them? Let's hear from the questions that have been sent to us by the attendees. The first one that I have is directed to Dr. Maud. It says, "Thank you so much for this insightful lecture that shines a bright light on the gender relations domain. you made a point that there was a link between GBV and socio-economic factors, considering that the cultural milieu is a superset and behavior is a subset, meaning that the cultural ethic has the power and the necessary resources to subdue or sanction the behavior that transgresses the moral code of society? Or could it be the case that the cultural ethic has gotten weakened to an extent of losing efficacy with respect to axiologic adherence and enforcement? I don't know if you got the question, Dr. Maud. Please unmute.
Yes, I did. Yes, I got the question, but I think the person who posed the question actually answers it at the end. While we might think that culture is the superset, we should be careful of culture because we can use some cultural practices to reinforce the oppression of women. So I agree culture is the superset, but we should be careful on how we use culture to promote and reinforce, to promote some stereotypes and reinforce gender-based violence, such as the culture we subscribe to the thinking that it is okay for a man to beat his wife from time to time. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. I hope the question has been answered. And the second one is directed again to Dr. Covet and Dr. Tendai. It says, I am wondering if any studies have ever been conducted on African matriarchal societies and their experiences during a pandemic. Should I repeat the question or is it clear? I am wondering if any studies have ever been conducted on African matriarchal societies and their experiences during the pandemic.
I'm not aware of any that focuses on matriarchal societies, especially during the pandemic, but a lot of studies has been done on the role of matriarchal societies, especially studies from Malawi and other African-based communities that ascribe to the power of the mother. But I'm not aware of any that was conducted during the pandemic, but lots of studies have been done. And also in my presentation, I talked about the agency theory, which also is upholding the role of the mothers across the African continent, not only in matrilineal societies, because you find that in single-headed households, the mother has to be the father and the mother. And there's an old book by Judith Clark from Guyana, My Mother Who Fathered Me. So they're both the mothers and the fathers. So I think I was trying to unpack the multiple roles that women play to the extent that they'll do anything, even including skipping a meal to save their children. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dikobe. I don't know if Dr. Tendai is online. The question is also directed at her, if she has anything to add. Dr. Tendai, Dr. Karisa?
Say, she's offline.
Oh, she's offline. Okay. Thank you so much for that response, Dr. Dikobe. And I'm also looking at your theory, the agency theory. I think it is a very significant theory because it makes us aware that agency and transcendence are very significant even in times of pandemics, that we should actually abandon life stultifying approaches and be agents in our own spaces and come up with life-affirming type of approaches that will maybe help us to solve the problems at hand. Thank you. Right,
Thank you very much, Dr. Passy.
Move on to the next question. To all panelists, besides using the gender lens, what else can be done in healing our communities from the wounds of violence that have been afflicted for a long time on us since colonialism, such that instead of resolving conflicts amicably, there is a default tendency to use violence? How do we go beyond the gender element and learn the art of resolving conflict through non-violent mechanisms? This is directed to all panelists. Prof. Sehobe, I don't know if you have anything to say to that question.
Thank you very much. Yes, I actually like that because there have been, I would say, innovative ways of addressing post-conflict reconstruction. One of the things that, in respect to what impact in the main comes from the pandemic as a, a disease that will lead to either morbidity and mortality, oftentimes the trauma that comes will be the trauma that comes with grief, and of course, grief being from loss or from illness. And in respect to children, I would say one of the things we learned from the HIV/AIDS pandemic, especially, is that the coping mechanisms that society brings in terms of healing beyond loss, beyond long-term or prolonged morbidity and then mortality, that children are quite resilient. But however, it is very important in terms of psychosocial and other forms of, I would say, psychological intervention in terms of treatment that we bring in other technologies or techniques. In this instance, many activists have found that art therapy is a very important tool through which healing processes can begin to be brought to bear, especially for children. So a number of innovative new programs can be done. The problem in this instance is that most funding agents or partners do not support psychosocial well-being programs. And this is where the challenge is for the human and social sciences, that to get funding for research that looks at these issues of psychosocial well-being that have no tangible ends that are visible in terms of numbers, is often sidelined in terms of research. Just art therapy, in terms of conflict zones, for example, in West Africa, the Liberian War, the Sierra Leonean War, which had a huge impact on children who were used as child soldiers, even in Uganda and the South Sudan. The interventions that have been used, which includes looking at indigenous methodologies of peace mobilization, peace education, need to be brought into bear. But I want to echo what Maud has said, in that let's not use culture as a palliative or as a default to overlook a critical issue in terms of culturally informed responses to post-conflict reconciliation or trauma counseling. And this is the fact that most of those tools that be drawn on from cultural lens oftentimes are informed by a very patriarchal, I would say, underpinning value system. So it's very important that whatever tools that we begin to bring to address the issue of trauma and recovery in a post-COVID world for children or any other sector of society, that those tools are also informed by a human rights lens that immediately positions, I would say, the agency and therefore also rights and the humanity of those who suffer that trauma. In talking about gender, as Tendai has said, let's just talk about women and girl children, but all those who will be violated. And oftentimes we forget that even men and boys do get violated in contexts such as these. And oftentimes we lose the lens to know that men can be traumatized and violated even in context of gender-based violence in times of peace. But we do know that in conflict periods, they are violated in ways that can also bring long-term harm to them. So all the tools we need to find must be informed first and foremost by a desire to center the person who's been violated at the heart of the healing process, but also to ensure that it's a sustainable healing process. And that, among other things, means programming to look at how psychosocial trauma can be approached from the point of view, a broader scope of mental health. And this also needs, I think, research in terms of what we know currently of what works and what doesn't work. Thank you.
Thank you for the response, Prof. Sehobe. We need new tools, not to replace those that are existing, but to add on life-sustaining tools that encompass everyone. I don't know if the other panelists have anything to add to this question because it was directed to all of them. Dr. Tendai, did you get the question? You were offline sometime ago. Okay, Dr. Dikobe.
Yeah, the question, and the person was asking about why the propensity towards gender lens. And I think gender lens is the most apt gender to look at how issues affect men and women differently. The problem is that sometimes we read gender as sex, and which is not the case. He was asking if there have been any studies that have used the gender lens to talk about conflict resolution using indigenous knowledge systems. I have an article from 2009 from literature, but published in the Journal of Peace Building and Development, which looks at how we can use stories and literature as sources of indigenous knowledge insights in peace building and development. So I think it just depends on the lens that we adopt, but we can take even the gender lens and also talk about how even war affects men and women differently, because for the most part it's the women who bear the brunt of wars, because the wars are taking place over the female body. So I would like the caller, the person who asked, to just say, like, we all, and myself included, just need to be open-minded so that we don't look at gender as necessarily just focusing on women, but as an all-inclusive conceptual framework that we can use to understand the relationships between men and women in general, even post-COVID-19. Thank you.
Yes, I would agree with you there, Dr. Dikobe, to say beyond the gender lens is an inclusive society, a human-centric society that is inclusive of men, women, and children. And also you make a very important point there that at times we need to rethink and maybe go back to our own traditions and see how those traditions can be therapeutic during this difficult time. Dr. Tendai, anything to add there? How do we go beyond the gender element and learn the art of resolving conflict through non-violent mechanisms? I know you brought in the intersectional lens that we need to cut across the board to actually resolve human issues that we are currently encountering.
Yes, it goes way, yeah, like what Prof. Dikobe just said. Remember that when we're talking about gender, it also changes over time, right? It's renegotiated, it's contested. So by using an intersectionality lens, we're saying that all the affected subjects pertaining to the issue of conflict might actually benefit from this conflict resolution using an intersectional lens. Now, when it comes to the issue of indigenous knowledge systems, I think we can actually propose a framework which manages to correlate those two paradigms using an intersectionality framework as well as an indigenous framework, feminist framework, to actually solve some of these problems. In such a way, most of those people that will be affected in these conflict areas will be attended to. Thank you.
And I think it is also very important that we should desist from, going back to colonialism and looking at colonialism as the center of all these problems, because some of these problems emanate from us in the contemporary sphere in which we live in, not from colonialism. So maybe it is time to look beyond colonialism and look at ourselves and see where we have gone wrong. According to Achebe, he says, we should look at where the rain began to beat us. Where did we go wrong to end up in such a situation? Our next question, Dr. Dikobe, what role can local governments play in addressing GBV issues, especially during the time of COVID-19?
I think hello? Okay. I think the role that can be played by the local governments, as we understand the local governments are part and parcel of the government system. So what I had proposed is like to have networks or minor commissions in all the districts. And those people representing the districts can then become the part of the larger gender commission, which is long overdue in Botswana. I know in South Africa, they have a gender commission. We still don't have the gender commission. Has been debated in parliament, but I think for the local governments, we'll be looking at the Dikosi and also at faith-based organizations, as well as the civil society, in order to be part of the different arms of the Commission on Gender, which will, among other things, look at gender-based violence, as well as the continuing unequal relationships between men and women in Botswana, and also the neglect of children, which has become also yet another pandemic coming out of COVID-19, where the sole responsibility is left in the hands of the mother, while the father is allowed to roam and not to pretend that they don't have this other extra responsibility that they have to pay attention to. So that's why I see the local government coming in. And also the local government should promote the involvement of women in decision-making forums so that they don't speak for women, but you have a balance between, you strike a balance so you have gender equity where both genders are represented in the decision-making forums. Thank you, Dr. Percy.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Maud. I think the question was answered fully. And maybe just to add on to say it is very important, I think, through the three presentations that we are reminded that to harness life-extending forces that are celebrated in our everyday experiences is very important. And this includes our indigenous knowledge systems. Right, I don't know if there are any more questions coming in, but we have about 3 minutes before I hand over to Prof. Sehobe. I was going to ask Dr. Tendai, the intersectional approach, besides the indigenous knowledge systems, what other approaches can we think of that can help us to address these challenges that we are facing in this pandemic?
Yes, if we are to solve any problem, I feel like we need to include the victims, right? So including a bottom-up approach where the victims who are experiencing the gender-based violence are actually, they contribute in terms of what the issues that the drivers that actually led to those domestic violence cases. So a grassroots involvement inclusive of indigenous knowledge systems as well as intersectionality might actually help us. In this case, I like what Dr. Doctor from Botswana actually said, when it comes to the operational, the committees, that gender-based committees or government committees, we need to involve those victims as well as from different vulnerabilities of different communities. So their voice should be heard. I think the question now is trying to find out a needs assessment of what exactly are the issues that they are facing and how can they be put in terms of policy framework as well as programming. So using a bottom-up approach as well as a grassroots involvement approach might lead us into a way where we can actually resolve some of the issues that are being faced, whether in conflict situations, whether in disaster situations, or in disease outbreaks, etc.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tendai. I have another question here that is directed to Professor Alina Sehobe. This was a very powerful lecture, and the statement, paraphrasing, that the future of the African child should be anchored on social cohesion based on the humanities, indigenous perspectives. What specific steps can be taken to advance this social cohesion? Prof?
Thank you very much. The issue of social cohesion is a very important one. I'm aware that the Human Science Research Council, for example, has undertaken quite a significant amount of research to look at social cohesion building. And South Africa has also been one of the few countries I know that has tried to develop a white paper that is looking at the issue of social cohesion. It may be that it's informed by its past, in this case, a past that has I'd say, violent past, especially when you look at the impact of apartheid on the Black family or Black lives. There are no easy routes towards developing social cohesion. As Dr. Covet has said, increasingly the fragmentation of the institution of family means that many people will end up alone, whether in their youth as children or in their old age. This is especially clear with the advent of technology. When we speak of the fourth industrial revolution, for example, many young children are growing up with television and telecommunication devices as their babysitters. So they're becoming less and less social beings, and perhaps you were fortunate to be. The question is, what is the commitment at policy level, not just of governments, but of communities to building those community networks that we need? I would say that one of the positive things that have happened, strangely enough, during COVID is the manner in which communities have come around to rebuild innovatively new ways of creating humanity and community livelihoods around the world. Because people were locked in, because people had limited movements, people began to take, I think, greater awareness of the environment. And I think in that regard, we see, and I would say, a ray of hope in how we can rebuild, reconstruct, how people begin to reconnect as human beings. And then part of this also has to do with the manner in which I would say liberal economies, or what you call post-liberal capitalist economies, have made consumption, for example, what we call the mall culture, the center of our pleasure and I'd say affirmation. With the lockdown and reduced opportunities to be in those spaces, people began to make do with less. People began to stay at home, cook at home, talk to each other, reduce their dependence on external stimuli like travel. And I think that's where we can begin to do some baseline research to see what else needs to happen. From the point of view of the indigenous knowledge systems, Maud has already highlighted how IKS can become a very important, powerful tool towards finding ways to rebuild what could be seen as a tenet of the future African family. And this is not to go back into some, I'd say, romanticized notion of the African extended family, but to look at how we can construct new forms of post-trauma, post-mortality communities where young children who are child-headed households can begin to find connectivities with other mentors in societies and create new social units that can begin to nurture and impart those values that make them to be able to stand up for themselves and have an opportunity into the future. It is not an easy process, but it's something that needs to start happening. But we as human and social science researchers need to take the lead in making sure that we provoke those conversations, we put those kinds of questions on the agenda, we get funding for those, and we can actually then have informed understanding of what we mean by social cohesion in the future, not from a romanticized lens, but from a very pragmatic and evidence-informed point of view. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. I do agree with you. I think human beings can achieve a lot as they recreate, create and recreate, invent and reinvent, construct and deconstruct processes and systems that have stifled the growth of humanity. I think I will end here. It's time up. And that was the last question that I had online. Let me conclude by a quotation from, it's actually an analogy that is used by Molara Ombudipe Leslie. She says, what characterizes African women as those who metaphorically carry 6 mountains on their backs. The 6 mountains on our backs in her analogy represent the meanings emanating from our location in Africa, with the accompanying history of interlocking oppressions in the burdens we carry. However, because these are on our backs as African women, we are able to move with them. We are able to carry them. Hence the significance of the gender lens. We need to include women. We need to make them visible. We need to make the children visible. They should be heard. And as we wrap up, Prof. Sehobe will round up the session for us. She will give the vote of thanks and a closure. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pasi, for those profound words. And thank you very much, colleagues, for the, I would say, stimulating discussions. Especially, I would like to thank Ms. Giliste Mokhatle for her very, very powerful artistic piece. I think in it she reminded us that being thankful and being grateful is one thing, but let us not mistake that for needing to be subservient or obedient in the face of oppression or violation. And this is oftentimes what has been done to children. We say to children, even when they've been violated, go and say thank you, go and be polite. So I think what this brings to me is the fact that in this discussion, we've tried to provoke ways in which we can begin to unpack how we relate, how we interact as human beings, how we form the language of interaction. And in that, I'll say, I appreciate very much what has been a very interesting journey carved between the Northwest University and NAST to ensure that we can draw so many voices together to engage and to find a way to create new meanings in terms of how we understand not only language, but how we understand voicing, how we understand positionality, and how we understand issues critical to our research in the human and social sciences. So I'd like to thank very much Professor Pamela Maseko, who's been our beacon and light in this journey as the Executive Dean on the other side in Northwest University. Dr. Moteo Koitsiwe, who has been also a powerful, I'd say, force behind the conceptualization and I'd say shaping of the discourses in this entire series. I would also like to thank Dr. Zulumatabo Zulu, who has also been not only a panelist in the last session and the one before that, but also an intellectual probing voice in terms of how we can better insert voices of Africanization or Africanity in our conversations about decolonizing knowledge and decolonizing ideas. Thank you very much, Dr. Pasi, for being our steering ship mentor in this conversation, and to the 2 other colleagues, Dr. Garutza, Dr. Dikobe, and also to the facilitators who have come before you, who have enabled these conversations to be heard beyond our own audiences. I'd like to thank further Northwest University's support technical committees or organs and units, the communications team who ensure that we have our programs and documents out in time to be able to circulate it. Mekoni, thank you very much for your inputs. And also the support from New Sounds, which have ensured that these webinars are very well, I would say, coordinated and broadcast and are there for posterity for us to look at. In concluding, I'd like to say we are not over with these conversations. There's one more to go. It's next week, same time, same place. And from there, we'll then hopefully be able to get so many more voices coming through out of these conversations, multiplying and ensuring that we continue across the human and social sciences, especially across Southern Africa, to generate these conversations. As we know today, there are more than 35 million children who are not in place of safety. There might be more than 40 million children who may never go back into classrooms at an ECD level. In other words, children under 5 who should have had the foundations of learning might never experience that, in the main due to COVID-19, but also from these other factors you've highlighted. Our cultural context that deny children the right to go to school, conflicts, hunger. So let us see how all of these intersecting challenges can bring us together as scholars across disciplines and find new tools that can begin to help us to unlock, especially the Pan-African lens that is necessary. So with that, let me thank you very much and say we've come to the end of our webinar for today, and I wish you all a good evening. Thank you.